Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. And unto this, Conan, destined to bear the jeweled crown of Aquilonia upon a troubled brow. It is I, his chronicler, who alone can tell thee of his saga. Let me tell you of the days of high adventure.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to yet another episode of Conan Chronicles. As always, I am your host, Dan, and today we're going to be doing a review and retrospective on the 11th Conan story ever published, The Devil in Iron. This one was penned by Mr. Robert E. Howard and first published in the August 1934 issue of Weird Tales magazine. Our story begins on the mysterious island of Zapur, where the remnants of a long-dead civilization lies in ruin. A Yuetshi fisherman wrecks his boat on the island one night and begins to wander into the ruins in search of whatever force had caused supernatural lightning to fork the skies. After some time, the fisherman stumbles upon a broken, dome-like structure and finds something horrifying inside.
Within the ruined dome, surrounded by stone dust and bits of broken masonry, lay a man on a golden block. He was clad in a sort of skirt and a shagreen girdle. His black hair, which fell in a square mane to his massive shoulders, was confined about his temples by a narrow gold band. On his bare, muscular breast lay a curious dagger with a jeweled pommel, a shagreen-bound hilt, and a broad crescent blade. It was much like the knife the fisherman wore at his hip, but it lacked the serrated edge and was made with infinitely greater skill. The man, of course, was dead, had been dead for many centuries. This dome was his tomb. The fisherman did not wonder by what art the ancients had preserved the body in such a vivid lightness of life, which kept the muscular limbs full and unshrunken, the dark flesh vital. The dull brain of the Yuetshi had room only for his desire for the knife, with its delicate waving lines along the dully gleaming blade. Scrambling down into the dome, he lifted the weapon from the man's breast. As he did so, a strange and terrible thing came to pass. The muscular, dark hands knotted convulsively. The lids flared open, revealing great, dark, magnetic eyes, whose stare struck the startled fisherman like a physical blow. The man on the dais heaved up to a sitting position, and the fisherman gaped at the full extent of his size, thus revealed. His narrowed eyes held the Yuetshi, and in those slitted orbs he read neither friendliness nor gratitude. He saw only a fire as alien and hostile as that which burns in the eyes of a tiger. Suddenly the man rose and towered above him, menace in his every aspect. As the great hands fell to his shoulders, he drew his saw-edged knife and struck upward with the same motion. The blade splintered against the stranger's corded belly as against a steel column. and then the fisherman's thick neck broke like a rotten twig in the giant hands.
The scene then shifts to the castle of a petty noble, a lord named Jehangir Agha, who plots with his closest advisor, Ghaznavi, to deal with a pressing threat to the lord's power. On the border of Turan, a tribe of warriors had emerged from the wild and mysterious steppes nearby to challenge the rule of Turan's king. A tribe called the Cossacks had went from a group of squabbling tribal nomads to a highly organized and united army under the command of a new chieftain named Conan. The Cossacks had taken significant territories on the borders of Turan, and the king was beginning to grow impatient with his lord, Agha, the minion he had appointed to govern this border territory. Agha, desperate to retain his lordship, discusses a plan to dispose of Conan and his Cossack horde permanently with his advisor. The two scheme to lure Conan to the island of Zapur with one of Agha's slaves, a former noblewoman named Octavia. They tell Octavia that she will be brought with them to a hostage exchange between themselves and Conan, where she will charm the barbarian and win his affection. After the exchange, Agha tells her he plans to send a letter to Conan, demanding to learn where his slave that the Cossacks had stolen is hiding on the island of Zapur. Once Conan ventures to this island to find the girl, Agha and his men will wait to murder the chieftain, leaving the Cossacks without their leader, ready to be slaughtered once and for all. Octavia protests this plan, but Agha threatens to have her raped by one of his servants, so she reluctantly agrees to go through with this plan. The scene then shifts to sometime after the initial meeting between Conan and Lord Agha. After Octavia had charmed Conan, Agha had sold her to another debauched lord as a sexual plaything. Unsatisfied with this fate, Octavia escapes her new master's estate and swims to Zapur. When she arrives, some shadowy figure wraps her in its arms and carries her off into the night as she screams in terror. The scene then shifts once again to Conan's perspective this time, as he is journeying to Zapur to find Octavia, the object of his barbarian lust. Lord Agha and his men observe Conan arriving on the island and wait patiently for their moment to strike. Conan wanders into the same ruins that the fisherman had before. Strangely, though, the ruins that the fisherman had found appear to have rebuilt themselves. Conan walks across a grand city square fit for a high civilization that also seems eerily silent until he hears footsteps nearby. To avoid whatever it is that's approaching, Conan slips into the open window of a house to hide. Inside, he's met with a beautiful and yet somehow eerie sight.
He stood for an instant statue-like then, as nothing happened. He was moving across the rugs toward an arched doorway, when a hanging was drawn aside, revealing a cushioned alcove from which a slender, dark-haired girl regarded him with languid eyes. "Are you looking for someone?" she asked, as indifferently as if the invasion of her chamber by an armed stranger were the most common thing imaginable. "Who are you?" he demanded. "I am Yatalai," she answered languidly. "I must have feasted late last night. I am so sleepy now. Who are you?" "I am Conan, a hetman among the Cossacks," he answered, watching her narrowly. "Conan," she repeated drowsily. "You are not a Dagonian. I suppose you are a mercenary. Have you cut the heads off many Yuetshi?" I do not war on water rats, he snorted. But they are very terrible, she murmured. I remember when they were our slaves, but they revolted and burned and slew. Only the magic of Khosatral Khel has kept them from the walls. She paused, a puzzled look struggling with the sleepiness of her expression. I forgot, she muttered. They did climb the walls last night. There was shouting and fire, and the people calling in vain on Khosatral. She shook her head as if to clear it. But that cannot be, she murmured, because I am alive, and I thought I was dead. It was a dream, she yawned. Perhaps it's all a dream. I feel like a dream now. I don't care. I can't remember something. I have forgotten. There is something I cannot understand, but I grow so sleepy when I try to think. Anyway, it doesn't matter. What do you mean? He asked uneasily. You said they climbed the walls last night? Who? The Yuetshi. I thought so anyway. A cloud of smoke hid everything, but a naked, blood-stained devil caught me by the throat and drove his knife into my breast. Oh, it hurt! But it was a dream, because, see, there is no scar. I cannot remember, she murmured, nestling her dark head against his mighty breast. Everything is dim and misty. It does not matter. You are no dream.
This strange woman, seemingly plucked from the distant past and the grasp of death itself, asks Conan to love her while she still walks the earth. Conan attempts to oblige, but the woman falls into a sudden and deep slumber. Frustrated and disappointed, Conan continues to wander the halls of the woman's house, when he hears some sort of gigantic presence moving towards him out of the darkness. Conan slips into a secret passageway in the hall. He closes the door of the secret chamber behind him and waits in the dark for whatever monster stalks the halls to burst into the secret chamber, but it eventually passes. Conan finds that this chamber connects to some tunnels beneath the house and continues wandering. During his wandering, Conan encounters a variety of strange sights in these tunnels, including a colossal jade serpent sleeping on a copper throne in one of the chambers he gets into. Conan is careful not to awaken this beast and continues on. After what feels like endless wandering through these tunnels beneath the city, Conan stumbles once again into a chamber he hadn't been in before, and hears something off in the distance whisper an incantation. Suddenly, the barbarian is overcome by his senses and has a vivid vision of Zapur's ancient past.
Transported beyond his age and his own individuality, he was seeing the transmutation of the being men called Khosatral Khel, which crawled up from the night and the abyss ages ago to clothe itself in the substance of the material universe. But human flesh was too frail, too paltry to hold the terrific essence that was Khosatral Khel. So he stood up in the shape and aspect of a man, but his flesh was not flesh, nor the bone bone, nor blood blood. He became a blasphemy against all nature, for he caused to live and think and act a basic substance that before had never known the pulse and stir of animate being. He stalked through the world as a god, for no earthly weapon could harm him, and to him a century was like an hour. In his wanderings he came upon a primitive people inhabiting the island of Dagonia, and it pleased him to give this race culture and civilization, and by his aid they built the city of Dagon, and they abode there and worshipped him. Strange and grisly were his servants, called from the dark corners of the planet where grim survivals of forgotten ages yet lurked. His house in Dagon was connected with every other house by tunnels, through which his shaven-headed priests bore victims for the sacrifice. But after many ages, a fierce and brutish people appeared on the shores of the sea. They called themselves Yuetshi, and after a fierce battle were defeated and enslaved, and for nearly a generation they died on the altars of Khosatral. His sorcery kept them in bonds. Then their priest, a strange gaunt man of unknown race, plunged into the wilderness, and when he returned, he bore a knife that was of no earthly substance. It was forged of a meteor, which flashed through the sky like a flaming arrow, and fell in a far valley. The slaves rose. Their saw-edged crescents cut down the men of Dagon like sheep, and against that unearthly knife the magic of Khosatral was impotent. While carnage and slaughter bellowed through the red smoke that choked the streets, the grimmest act of that grim drama was played in the cryptic dome behind the great daïsed chamber with its copper throne and its walls mottled like the skin of serpents. From that dome, the Yuetshi priest emerged alone. He had not slain his foe because he wished to hold the threat of his loosing over the heads of his own rebellious subjects. He had left Khosatral lying upon the golden dais with the mystic knife across his breast for a spell to hold him senseless and inanimate until doomsday. But the ages passed, and the priest died. The towers of deserted Dagon crumbled. The tales became dim, and the Yuetshi were reduced by plagues and famines and war to scattered remnants, dwelling in squalor along the seashore. Only the cryptic dome resisted the rot of time, until a chance thunderbolt and the curiosity of a fisherman lifted from the breast of the god the magic knife and broke the spell. Khosatral Khel rose and lived and waxed mighty once more. It pleased him to restore the city as it was in the days before its fall. By his necromancy he lifted the towers from the dust of forgotten millennia, and the folk which had been dust for ages moved in life again. But folk who had tasted of death are only partly alive. In the dark corners of their souls and minds, death still lurks unconquered. By night the people of Dagon moved and loved, hated and feasted, and remembered the fall of Dagon and their own slaughter only as a dim dream. They moved in an enchanted mist of illusion, feeling the strangeness of their existence, but not inquiring the reasons therefor. With the coming of day, they sank into deep sleep, to be roused again only by the coming of night, which is akin to death.
After this strange, psychedelic vision of the ancient past, Conan continues to wander the labyrinthian tunnels beneath this city of ghosts, now wary of the demonic entity that had once brought culture and civilization to this cursed island. Suddenly, he hears a muffled scream from an adjoining chamber. Just as he is able to regain his senses, the demonic Khosatral Khel emerges from a nearby door. Conan leaps to meet the demon in battle, but is surprised when his sword simply bounces off the iron skin of the demonic god. In desperation, Conan rips a tapestry from the wall and wraps it around the demon's head. While it's distracted, Conan desperately runs in the direction of the scream he had heard earlier and finds Octavia frozen in terror. The Cimmerian scoops the girl up in his arms without saying a word and sprints away from Khosatral Kell, locking every door in the tunnels behind them as they both listen to the splintering of wood and metal off in the distance. Conan's efforts do nothing but temporarily stall the unstoppable devil in iron. In her extreme terror, Octavia breaks down and tells Conan that they are both destined to perish in these tunnels. She asks the barbarian to give her a swift death, but he refuses. Conan tells her that he plans to distract this demon so that she can escape and take the boat he had arrived in away from this place. Suddenly, the demon's pounding ceases. Unbeknownst to Conan and Octavia, Lord Agha and his men had been discovered by one of Khosatra Kell's ghostly subjects, and the demon had left to go deal with that more present threat. Conan seizes this momentary opportunity to plan a means of escaping with their lives, and tells Octavia that they must find the magic Yuetchi blade that had trapped Khosatral Kell on an altar for thousands of years. Perhaps this blade would do more than just bounce off the demon's iron hide. The barbarian realizes that the only way back to the dome where the blade rested, after the fisherman had tried to steal it at the beginning of the story, was through the chamber where the giant snake he had carefully avoided earlier slumbers. Conan desperately tells Octavia to wait for him behind the door to this chamber, and that if the demon arrives to end their lives, that she should run and continue on without him. He tells her nothing of the jade serpent sleeping within, and quickly rushes into the chamber before she can voice any objections to his plan. Conan carefully moves through the chamber so that he doesn't awaken the sleeping horror, when suddenly, Octavia bursts through the door in tears. She loudly tells Conan that she's afraid to stay alone and wishes to go with him, which awakens the horror in the chamber.
She threw up her hands with a terrible scream, as for the first time she saw the occupant of the throne. The wedge-shaped head had lifted from its coils and thrust out toward her on a yard of shining neck. Then, with a smooth, flowing motion, it began to ooze from the throne, coil by coil, its ugly head bobbing in the direction of the paralyzed girl. Conan cleared the space between him and the throne with a desperate bound, his scimitar swinging with all his power. And with such blinding speed did the serpent move that it whipped about and met him in full mid-air, lapping his limbs and body with half a dozen coils. His half-checked stroke fell futilely as he crashed down on the dais, gashing the scaly trunk but not severing it. Then he was writhing on the glass steps, with fold after slimy fold knotting about him, twisting, crushing, killing him. His right arm was still free, but he could get no purchase to strike a killing blow, and he knew one blow must suffice. With a groaning convulsion of muscular expansion that bulged his veins almost to bursting on his temples and tied his muscles in quivering, tortured knots, he heaved up on his feet, lifting almost the full weight of that 40-foot devil. An instant he reeled on wide-braced legs, feeling his ribs caving in on his vitals and his sight growing dark, while his scimitar gleamed above his head. Then it fell, shearing through the scales and flesh and vertebrae, and where there had been one huge writhing cable, now there were horribly two, lashing and flopping in the death throes. Conan staggered away from their blind strokes. He was sick and dizzy, and blood oozed from his nose. Groping in a dark mist, he clutched Octavia and shook her until she gasped for breath. "Next time, I tell you to stay somewhere," he gasped. "You stay!"
Conan leads Octavia into the dome as he had planned originally, and scoops up the magic blade. Off in the distance, the the pair hears Lord Agha's men being slaughtered by the demon. The pair rush into the grand city square and see Lord Agha about to cowardly depart the island on Conan's boat in terror. The Lord notices Conan and decides to fire his final arrow in his quiver at the barbarian, which Conan easily dodges. The Cimmerian then rushes to meet the Lord in close combat. He swiftly disposes of Lord Agha, slicing his side all the way to the spine. Conan and Octavia have little time to celebrate the death of this evil man before the demonic ruler of Zapur appears to engage Conan in battle. The barbarian leaps at Khosatra Kel, armed with the magic blade, and slashes at the demon. The great Khosatral Kel falls and writhes under Conan's furious assault, and the barbarian drives the magic blade through the dark god's heart. Conan watches on in sheer terror as the demon's dying corpse shifts and changes into some unfathomable horror, revealing its true evil form. The Cimmerian relishes his victory, and despite Octavia's protests, forces himself on her by kissing her. She initially protests his advances, but quickly finds herself clinging to the barbarian's neck. The story ends with Octavia cheekily asking Conan whether he believes he is Lord Agha's equal in sexual prowess. The barbarian replies, laughing, by saying that she will have to be the judge of such things. Reading The Devil in Iron was sort of a strange experience for me. This story is, I think, in a technical sense, the worst Conan story I've read thus far. It's just structured really strangely. The character perspective that Howard has us following shifts constantly. Key events that are crucial to the plot are skipped over, only to be recapped later on in the story. And Conan doesn't even show up until the beginning of the 4th chapter. The story itself only has 6 chapters. The structure of the story just feels really clumsy to me, if I'm being honest. It's almost as if this was a first draft that needed a few more passes at editing and rewriting before it saw publication. The story begins in the perspective of a Yuetchi fisherman who discovers this sleeping god and awakens it from its magic-induced slumber, sort of like the beginning of Black Colossus, actually. Then the perspective shifts in Chapter 2 to Lord Agha as he plots to introduce Octavia to Conan at a prisoner exchange. Chapter 3 then shifts to Octavia's perspective as she escapes the castle of the lord she was sold to by Agha after the prisoner exchange occurred, which we don't see. This is Conan's main motivation for the rest of the story when we meet him. I just thought it was very weird that that entire scene was entirely skipped over. We're only told about how beautiful Conan thought she was after this prisoner exchange occurred in a passing narration. I realize that their relationship in this story is based almost entirely on Conan's lust, but the story lacking the establishment of this character connection makes their relationship feel even more superficial than it may have been otherwise. It's sort of a thin motivation for Conan to go off on already, but defying the old writing adage of show, don't tell doesn't help this at all. Octavia fleeing the Lord's castle to the island where the trap is supposed to take place is also sort of strange and unexplained to me. Has she fled there purposefully? If so, why? As far as she knows, this barbarian man who wants her to be his concubine is no friend of hers, and civilization hasn't been on this island for thousands of years. It's kind of a desolate place. Or did she not know where this island was when her master spoke of it before, and she just coincidentally stumbles upon the island that the plot needs her to stumble onto? She seems to be sort of generally aware of these islands off the coast of where she wandered after escaping, but the answer to this question of how or why she went to this island is kind of murky. I also thought it was sort of awkward that Conan just has a dream at the exact time he needs to in the plot that explains the entire backstory of the Dagonian civilization and their demonic god. It just seemed a little convenient to me. One of the most interesting things about this story, to me, is that Howard just sort of makes Conan Genghis Khan in this story. In this one, Howard casts Conan as the chieftain of a previously scattered and disparate nomadic people from the steppes. Conan united these barbarians into a mighty army, and had already begun invading a more advanced civilization with great success before the story begins. However, we see little to nothing of how Conan functions in this status quo of his life, as essentially a Mongol warrior chief. The way the story is structured, we get to see everyone reacting to the appearance of this extraordinary leader and his army, but nothing else. By the time we meet Conan, he's already landed on Zapur, and when the story ends, Conan is on his way back to his tribe. He's completely isolated for most of the story, except for the interactions he has with Octavia and Lord Agha. I just wish this whole Genghis Khan parallel that is obviously going on here was a bit more thoroughly explored. The Devil in Iron really does feel like an idea for a longer story that could have been really interesting, but had to be truncated due to the limitations of the Pulp magazine short story medium. What had to be truncated or cut out entirely feels missing. Reading this story feels like reading a series of fragmented chapters that loosely connect with each other. If Howard had taken some time to restructure this story, fleshed this out as a longer novella, and had it published in parts across a number of Weird Tales issues like some of the later, longer Conan works were, this could have been a great story, I think. As it is, however, I think it unfortunately falls into the category of forgettable Conan stories, for the most part. And I say for the most part because this story did provoke some genuinely interesting thoughts when I was reading about Khosatral Khel, this demonic god who brought civilization to his people that is the villain of the story. I think that Khosatral Khel is one of the more interesting Conan antagonists that I've read in one of these stories so far, actually. I was thinking that this deity reminded me of the ancient Sumerian god Enki. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. But he's one of the principal deities in the pantheon of Sumerian gods who is worshipped by the various civilizations at various times that came to dominate ancient Mesopotamia, including the Sumerians themselves, the Akkadians, and the Babylonians. The Sumerians are generally regarded as one of, if not the first, highly organized civilization records exist of, and Mesopotamia, or modern-day Iraq, is regarded as the birthplace of human civilization because of them. The Sumerians worshipped a pantheon of gods similar to the Greeks, who were human-like in that they had fallible personalities. These gods were often petty, vengeful, lustful, drunk, etc., in addition to some of the more positive qualities associated with divinity. They were very flawed individuals. The Sumerians and the other civilizations of Mesopotamia believed that all things in the world sprung from these gods, and the various designs that they had for humanity. Enki was the god of water, knowledge, crafts, and creation. He was often spoken of as a trickster god, who wore a somewhat sinister-looking horned crown upon his head. Enki was known to be fond of revealing knowledge and wisdom to the legendary heroes of Sumeria like Gilgamesh, through unexpected means. In addition to his powers, Enki was also the keeper of what the Sumerians referred to as the Mies, or the gifts of civilization. To the Sumerians, these were the ideological and methodical means of creating and preserving civilization that the gods bestowed upon humanity. These gifts, in their view, explained why their civilization was able to emerge out of humanity's more primitive, nomadic state. What Mies were varied widely and included things like the idea of monarchy, the idea of organized religion, the idea of truth, the concept of laws, the art of war, visual art, music, sexual intercourse, and peace. Enki was believed to bestow these building blocks of civilization on humanity and the various other gods who populated the Sumerian pantheon, and this allowed civilization to flourish in Mesopotamia. I'm not 100% sure that Howard was thinking of Enki or the gifts of civilization that he bestowed upon the ancient Sumerians when he was writing this. However, I think it's a very strong possibility because Ishtar is a deity in Howard's Hyborian age. Many people in the various Conan stories that I've read invoke her name, including Conan himself. Ishtar is one of the primary goddesses in the Sumerian pantheon, as she's the deity representing love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and political power. I don't think it's too much of a stretch to think that Howard may have been interested in the rest of the Sumerian pantheon and incorporated aspects of them into these stories. Khosatral Khel serves a very similar role in the development of the civilization that worships him here. Conan's vision tells him that this demonic god bestowed culture and civilization upon his people, including all of its good and ugly features. Khosatral Khel enslaved the Yuetchi, making them the lowly slave class of the decadent Dagon civilization. This race hated their masters due to being kept in bondage. The ghostly woman that Conan encountered and the barbarian's vision speak of at least one slave rebellion that eventually resulted in the complete collapse of Dagonic civilization. Slavery has been a common practice in almost every human civilization across the world for the vast majority of human history, and some societies incorporated slavery as an institutional pillar of their civilization. Perhaps the most advanced slave society of the ancient world was the famous Greek city-state and grand empire in its day, ancient Sparta. It's hard to underestimate how important slavery was to Spartan society. In ancient Sparta, class divisions between men, women, and slaves were rigid for a very specific reason. Sparta's political system was almost singularly focused on transforming Sparta into the greatest military power of the Greek world. To this end, Spartan males who were deemed worthy of growing into full citizens of Sparta were subjected to brutal and rigorous military training from a young age via the Spartan agoge martial education system. Spartan men were expected to train as warriors for their whole lives. There was never a free moment. They were expected to be the most proficient warriors of the entire ancient world. As one can imagine, this left very little time for the productive work needed for a civilization to function, like manufacturing goods, harvesting food, trading, constructing buildings, etc. Women's role in Spartan society was essentially running the estates that their Spartan warrior husbands were granted for their service in the military. As the men were not around to be the masters of their household while on campaign, the women became something like plantation owners of the old American South. Spartan women received much of the same training as men in the martial arts when they were young, but as adults they were responsible for raising their female children, keeping the estate in good order, and keeping their slaves in line. Slaves occupied the lowest status in Spartan society. The Spartans subjugated a class of people they referred to as the Helots. The Helots were responsible for doing all the productive labor of Spartan society, and because massive amounts of Helots were needed to keep this society functioning, the Helots were said to have outnumbered the Spartan citizenry by 7-1. This created an intense sense of paranoia in the Spartan elite and their fellow Spartan citizens about the possibility of a slave rebellion that would rise up and destroy the great Spartan regime. Because of this, Spartan citizens held Helots in extreme contempt. The Helots were subjected to all manner of public humiliation. They were viewed as inherently inferior to Spartans, and the Spartans did everything they could to keep the Helots living in a constant state of fear. The aim of this policy of terrorism wrought upon the Helots was to deter them from organizing their large numbers into a rebellion against their masters. There was a wide variety of Spartan policies, practices, and institutions that had the express purpose of keeping the Helot population in line, but perhaps the most brutal of these was the Spartan institution known as the Cryptia. The Cryptia were the Spartan secret police. Only the best young warriors from the agoge were accepted into their ranks. Their primary objective was to spy on the Helots, who lived mostly in the Spartan countryside, and suppress rebellion at any cost. One of their particularly sinister techniques in instilling fear and preventing Helot organization into an armed rebellion eventually became an official Spartan holiday. Every autumn, the political leaders of Sparta would officially declare war on the Helots, and gave license to the Cryptia to murder whichever Helots they chose, openly and without any legal consequences. The Cryptia were encouraged to murder the strongest and most ambitious Helots that may emerge as leaders of their community. This was a very effective means of terrorizing the Helots, as the Cryptia knew very well which Helots had ambition to be anything more than a slave, and would use the autumn war holiday as a means of eliminating them. Despite the best efforts of the Cryptia, there were some slave rebellions throughout the history of ancient Sparta, but none of them were successful in overthrowing the regime. These rebellions simply fueled the fear, hatred, and paranoia that Spartan citizens felt towards their slaves, which, as I said before, greatly outnumbered them. One of the other societies that incorporated slavery very intimately into its political system was, of course, the United States. There are obviously many differences between ancient Sparta and the American South pre-emancipation of slaves in 1863, but there are also many striking similarities. The social structure of the American South also incorporated slavery as a major institution, but for a different purpose than what the ancient Spartans had. The Old South basically had three classes: the white landed gentry who owned plantations and were the political leaders of society. Then you had the white working class, who were often small farmers and were free, but occupied a distinctly lower place in social status from the southern elites. And finally, on the very bottom, were the African American slaves, who worked the plantations of the landed gentry. While the ancient Spartans incorporated slavery into their society so intricately to become the finest warriors in the ancient Greek world, the Old South was arranged this way to create what Plato called philosopher kings. The political leaders of colonial British America in the post-revolutionary period were classically educated, as was the norm amongst European elites of the day. American political leaders were trained in Latin, read political philosophy of the ancients, and studied history. Sparta was one of the main inspirations for early American political elites in how their experiment in Protestant republicanism should be socially structured. To demonstrate, I'll read you some quotes from two of the most prominent pro-slavery intellectuals of the American South. A professor named Thomas Roderick Dew from Virginia, long the most prosperous and powerful colony and later state in British America, once said this in a piece entitled "The Abolition of Negro Slavery." Quote, "In the ancient republics of Greece and Rome, where the spirit of liberty glowed with the most intensity, the slaves were more numerous than the freemen. In Sparta, the freeman was even forbidden to perform the office of slaves, lest he might lose the spirit of independence." James Henry Hammond, who was at various times in his life a famous lawyer, governor of South Carolina, a U.S. representative from South Carolina, and a U.S. senator from South Carolina, once said this on the floor of the U.S. Senate on the topic of slavery. Quote, "In all social systems, there must be a class to do the menial duties, to perform the drudgery of life. It constitutes the very mudsill of society." These proponents of the Southern way of life believed that if slavery did not exist to keep their society functioning, the South would be unable to produce the class of Southern gentlemen who were so thoroughly trained in the arts of politics and statecraft that their society would fall into ruin. They clinged to this notion fervently enough to fight a civil war over it, because this strategy, from a purely Machiavellian sense, was very successful. The South produced 8 of the first 16 U.S. presidents, with 7 of these men either being born in or hailing from the state of Virginia, the seat of American political power for most of its early history. It's no coincidence that the Confederate separatists during the Civil War chose Richmond, Virginia as the capital of their new nation. Some of the men who belonged to this group of Southern gentlemen include titans of American political history, such as George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson. Just as slavery allowed the Spartans to produce the finest warriors of the ancient world, slavery allowed the South to produce the most adept political leaders of early American history. While Northerners were not insignificant in early American politics by any stretch of the imagination, Southerners were the dominant faction in American political life for a very long time. This social arrangement also produced similar levels of fear, hatred, and paranoia amongst Southern whites, who were on constant guard against African Americans fighting to overthrow the Southern social order. Naturally, like the Helots in Sparta, African Americans did not take kindly to being subjected by such an evil social system. This is a system that regarded them as property without the need or capacity to experience freedom. They had to toil the fields every day, were brutally beaten, and forced to live in squalor. Slave rebellions were very common in America's pre-emancipation period, and rebellious slaves often cooperated with American enemies in times of war in exchange for their freedom. Like the Spartans, a variety of methods were used to terrorize African American slaves in an effort to keep them in line and complacent with their status as the lowest class in American society. These efforts were highly organized and sometimes even funded by the state. They reached their peak of horror during the post-emancipation period in the form of the Ku Klux Klan and the lynching of African Americans. These methods developed at a time when it was very important for white Southerners to keep African Americans relegated to the lowest status in their society, despite the success of the Republican Party's emancipatory movement and the Union's victory in the Civil War. If you'd like to read more about how the institution of slavery changes the collective psychology of a society into a culture of fear, hatred, and paranoia, I'd recommend a book by an author named Alan Taylor called The Internal Enemy: Slavery and War in Virginia, 1772 to 1832, which is a great historical account of how African Americans were viewed by white Southerners during this period in American history. He goes into great detail about, in my view, the very predictable byproducts of such a culture. Khosatral Kel's people, the Dagonians, display a similar level of fear, paranoia, and hatred towards the Yuetshi people, whom their evil god enslaved for their benefit. Conan himself even refers to the Yuetshi as water rats when speaking of them, demonstrating that racist attitudes towards these people in their culture still persists hundreds of years after the fall of Dagon. I think this is unfortunately a realistic portrayal of the staying power racist notions can have in the collective consciousness of people. The United States certainly has not disposed of the old racism that defined so much of its history as a nation. It has just taken new forms. The Yuetshi carried out a slave rebellion against the Dagonians and their god that was successful. They sacked the city, trapped their god in a thousands-year-long slumber, and destroyed their civilization. The Yuetshi succeeded in living out the worst nightmares of ancient Spartans and American Southerners for much of America's history. They successfully overthrew the slave society that had oppressed them. I think this is an interesting thematic feature of the story, given how Khosatral Kel is portrayed as simultaneously an evil god and the giver of the gifts of civilization. Slavery has been a feature of human civilization for most of our history, and Khosatral Kel's gift of this institution to his people is what in large part built their civilization, but ultimately was the thing that was its doom. One of the themes that runs through many of these Conan stories is that civilization can be, and often is, just as if not more evil than the barbarous customs of Conan and his Sumerian people living in the frozen north. Conan himself often reviles these horrifying evils of civilized men, like what we see in the Iron Shadows in the Moon story, where he's offended by the notion of civilized men using their daughters as pawns in their political games and even selling their own children into slavery. Conan draws a favorable comparison between Sumerian culture and the culture of the civilized kingdoms of the Hyborian Age by saying that Sumerians would never treat their children in such a cruel way. I like Khosatral Kel as an antagonist for Conan because he is essentially the divine personification of the evils of civilization, the culture and rituals that repulse Conan so thoroughly, and I think often repulse all of us. Slavery, as a concept, is perhaps one of the most horrific aspects of human civilization's history, in my view. And that probably has a lot to do with the fact that I was born and raised in the United States, where the legacy of this evil is very much still with us. Seeing the negative effect that being a slave society has had on the collective American psyche my entire life, I suppose makes me angry, sad, and horrified in a variety of different ways that people from other nations may not quite understand the way that Americans do. But I think everyone can understand that being in the position of a slave, in a society with race and class divisions as rigid as those in Sparta and America, would likely be the least preferable variant of human existence. While civilization has many wonderful aspects, there's also a dark side to it. Slavery is hardly the only evil that human civilization engages in, but such things, unfortunately, don't surprise me. Human individuals are creatures with the capacity for great good and great evil, as I discussed a bit in my review of The Frost Giant's Daughter. It's hardly surprising that such creatures as we are don't lose our capacity for evil when organized into large groups as powerful as nations and empires. Not only do these human organizations commit singular acts of evil, they often institutionalize them as long-standing laws, customs, and rituals. Will humanity ever be able to truly leave these dark aspects of ourselves behind? I hope so, but it remains to be seen, I suppose. These sorts of thoughts that the backstory of Dagon and Khosatral Khel provoked in my mind were enough for me to get some enjoyment out of this story. I just wish these ideas and themes were explored by Howard in a story that was a little bit more focused and structurally sound. Overall, I think I'd say that this story probably ranks low amongst the other Conan stories I've read at this point in time for the show, but I think I do like it more than both Iron Shadows in the Moon and The Pool of the Black One, simply because those stories didn't have ideas in them that interested me as much as the backstory of Khosatral Khel and the society that he gave the gifts of civilization to. Iron Shadows in the Moon had some very interesting stuff about women's role in society at the time, don't get me wrong. That was definitely my favorite aspect of that story. However, I feel like seeing Conan fighting the mythical embodiment of the evils of human civilization interested me just a little bit more. Khosatral Khel is a great villain because he plays directly into one of the central themes of Conan's stories, civilization versus barbarism, and the dark side of the human psyche. The gifts of civilization he gave to his people, and the institution of slavery he bestowed upon them being the harbinger of their doom, is a pretty powerful thematic idea, in my view. Among the 3 stories that I'd rank as the worst Conan stories I've read thus far for the show, The Devil in Iron ranks at the top of that heap for me, because The Pool of the Black One is almost entirely devoid of interesting thematic ideas in my view, and I liked the ideas in this story just a little bit more than the ones in Iron Shadows in the Moon. Alright, so I think that's where I'm going to end off my review of The Devil in Iron. I'd like to thank all of you graciously for watching. But before I let you go, as always, I'd like to say a few words regarding how you can experience this story yourself and support our show if you'd like. In the description below, I've included a link to an audiobook version of this story. The one I excerpted for this video is from a great channel called Pulp Hero Audio. The person who runs that channel does great work. So if you're like me and just don't have a lot of time to sit down and read prose, definitely check that out. It's a good way to digest these stories in a very short amount of time. If you enjoyed this video, it would mean so much to me if you subscribed to the channel, liked the video, and posted your thoughts on this story, my video, or anything else Conan related in the comments below. All of these sorts of engagements with the video here on the channel help Conan Chronicles get recommended to more people as they surf YouTube looking for things to watch. Millions of videos get uploaded here every day, so it can be difficult to cut through the kind of white noise. But YouTube promotes videos that get lots of likes, views, and comments, so it would help quite a bit if you did all those things. We also have a Patreon for Conan Chronicles where you can support the show monetarily. Any amount you can chip in really helps. You'll also get access to the more freeform podcast show I do with a co-host, one of my good friends named Josh. I've uploaded a sampler as a celebration for our 100th subscriber to the channel, which is a discussion that Josh and I did on the various comic book adaptations of the Tower of the Elephant. But if you'd like access to future episodes, definitely subscribe to the Patreon, because we're going to be doing monthly episodes of that show. This month, the episode is a commentary track on the 1982 Conan the Barbarian film, the original one. I'm on that track, Josh is on it, and one of our friends named Austin, also known as the Day Ghost. He appears on Geekvolution quite a bit. I don't know how much crossover I have with that audience, but I think it's quite a bit. So if you'd like access to that and anything other than the clip that I'll upload as a sampler to the channel, definitely sub to the Patreon. It's a great episode. I think we did a cool and fun job doing a commentary for that one. Finally, Conan Chronicles is also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, so if you never want to miss an episode, get updates on the show, and see some awesome pieces of Conan artwork that I find while scouring Google for images for this show, check out those pages as well. The very last thing I'd like to do before I let you go is invite you to join me for the next episode. We're going to be leaving the middle period of Conan's stories, which is exciting in the next episode. We're going to be taking a look at the 12th Conan story in publication order, The People of the Black Circle. I hope you'll join me for that one, but until next time, dear listener, I bid you farewell.
Khosatral Khel was towering above him, his arms lifted like mauls. But as the blade caught the sheen of the sun, the giant gave back suddenly. But Conan's blood was up. He rushed in, slashing with the crescent blade. Under its edge, the dusky metal of Khosatral's body gave way like common flesh beneath a cleaver. From the deep gash flowed a strange ichor, and Khosatral cried out like the dirging of a great bell. His terrible arms flailed down, but Conan, quicker than the archers who had died beneath those awful flails, avoided their strokes and struck again and yet again. Khosatral reeled and tottered. His cries were awful to hear, as if metal were given a tongue of pain, as if iron shrieked and bellowed under torment. Then Khosatral turned again, flailing the air with desperate blows. But Conan, fired to berserk fury, was not to be denied. As a panther strikes down a bull moose at bay, so he plunged under the bludgeoning arms and drove the crescent blade to the hilt under the spot where a human's heart would be. Khosatral reeled and fell. In the shape of a man he reeled, but it was not the shape of a man that struck the loam. Where there had been the likeness of a human face, there was no face at all, and the metal limbs melted and changed. Conan, who had not shrunk from Khosatral living, recoiled blenching for Khosatral dead, for he had witnessed an awful transmutation. In his dying throes, Khosatral Khel had become again the thing that had crawled up from the abyss millennia gone.